Within hours of the Hiroshima detonation, before coherent assessments had reached Tokyo or formal responses had been drafted, American intelligence systems registered a distinct signal that something in the Japanese command environment had shifted. The change was not dramatic in form. It did not arrive as a confession, a surrender overture, or an explicit acknowledgement of catastrophe. It arrived instead as a single high-level transmission moving across channels that American cryptanalytic units had monitored for years, a message whose routing, urgency, and internal phrasing immediately marked it as anomalous against the baseline of routine wartime traffic. For analysts accustomed to extracting meaning from pattern rather than content alone, the deviation was unmistakable. The message originated within the highest tier of Japanese governmental communications, moving through diplomatic circuits rather than purely military ones, which itself was notable given that operational military matters were normally insulated from foreign-facing channels. Its priority markers suggested a directive intended for rapid relay rather than deliberation, and its timing, so closely aligned with the Hiroshima strike, collapsed any remaining ambiguity about causation. This was not a coincidental communication occurring in parallel with the attack. It was a reaction to it, composed under conditions of uncertainty and transmitted before the institutional machinery of the Japanese state had fully absorbed what had occurred. American intelligence officers did not initially know the full content in plain language. Decryption lagged transmission as it always did, but structural indicators alone were sufficient to trigger heightened scrutiny. Routing paths that had been dormant for weeks became active. Cipher systems reserved for matters of strategic gravity were employed rather than lower-grade codes used for routine diplomacy. The sender was a figure whose communications history was sparse and tightly clustered around moments of internal crisis. To analysts trained in traffic analysis, these factors collectively signaled that the Japanese leadership was not merely reacting tactically but attempting to orient itself cognitively to an event that had disrupted its existing models of American capability. When partial decrypts became available, the assessment sharpened. The language was restrained to the point of abstraction, carefully avoiding explicit descriptions of the weapon or the damage, yet it revolved around a single imperative: verification. The Japanese leadership was seeking confirmation not from internal military channels, but from diplomatic observers abroad, implicitly acknowledging that their own reporting mechanisms were insufficient to characterize what had happened. This inversion, asking external missions to validate an internal catastrophe, was immediately recognized by American intelligence as significant. It suggested not only shock but a temporary breakdown in confidence within Japan's own command and control information flow. Equally revealing was what the message did not contain. There was no reference to immediate retaliation, no invocation of decisive battle doctrine, no framing of the event within the established narrative of sacrifice and endurance. Instead, the tone was procedural, almost bureaucratic, as though the leadership were attempting to stabilize the situation by forcing it into existing administrative categories. For American analysts, this restraint was more alarming than defiance would have been. It indicated that the Japanese state had encountered something that did not yet fit within its ideological or operational lexicon and was buying time to understand it before responding. The recognition of this message's significance was rapid and institutional rather than individual. It moved up the intelligence chain not as an isolated curiosity but as corroboration of a broader assessment already forming in Washington. The atomic strike had not merely destroyed a city. It had penetrated the Japanese decision-making apparatus at its most sensitive level, inducing an immediate informational reflex that exposed uncertainty, fragmentation, and a reliance on external confirmation. The intercepted transmission became one of the first concrete indicators that the weapon's psychological and organizational effects were unfolding faster than its physical consequences could be measured. From that moment, American planners understood that they were no longer operating solely in the domain of material attrition. The intercepted message demonstrated that the Hiroshima attack had forced the Japanese leadership into a reactive posture defined by information gaps rather than strategic initiative. Intelligence officers did not interpret this as imminent collapse, nor did they assume it would produce swift capitulation. What it revealed instead was a crack in the epistemic foundation of the Japanese war effort, a moment when the leadership's ability to interpret reality lagged behind events themselves. That realization, derived from a single intercepted message moving quietly through the ether, reshaped how American intelligence evaluated every subsequent Japanese communication in the days that followed. Before the content of the intercepted message was fully decrypted, expectations within U.S. intelligence circles were shaped less by optimism than by a set of disciplined assumptions grounded in prior experience with Japanese strategic communications. Analysts did not anticipate a revelation in the conventional sense. Years of traffic analysis, partial decrypts, and behavioral study had conditioned them to expect indirection, procedural language, and a deliberate avoidance of explicit admission, particularly in moments of crisis. The working presumption was that any immediate response from Tokyo would be framed to preserve institutional coherence rather than to convey operational truth, and that the message would seek to stabilize internal hierarchies before acknowledging the external implications of the Hiroshima event. Within cryptanalytic units and intelligence branches in Washington and the Pacific, the dominant expectation was that the message would fall into one of several familiar categories. It might request clarification from diplomatic posts without conceding uncertainty at the center. It might attempt to contextualize the attack as an extension of existing American bombing capabilities, thereby preserving continuity with prior assessments. Or it might redirect attention toward information control, emphasizing secrecy and message discipline to prevent uncontrolled narratives from forming within the Japanese bureaucracy. None of these possibilities suggested strategic capitulation or even strategic reevaluation. They were seen instead as mechanisms through which a highly centralized system absorbed shocks without altering its underlying assumptions. There was also a clear expectation that the language would be cautious to the point of opacity. Japanese high-level communications, particularly those transmitted in the immediate aftermath of military setbacks, had historically exhibited a preference for euphemism and abstraction. American analysts anticipated references to new conditions or unusual developments rather than direct acknowledgement of a qualitatively new weapon. This was not interpreted as deception in the narrow sense, but as a structural feature of how the Japanese state managed cognitive dissonance. Intelligence officers understood that explicit naming of a phenomenon often lagged its internal recognition, especially when such naming threatened doctrinal or ideological stability. Another assumption concerned audience. Analysts believed the message was unlikely to be intended as a directive for decisive action. Instead, they expected it to function as a coordination signal, aligning senior figures around a shared understanding of what could safely be said and what questions could be asked. In this sense, the message was expected to reveal less about Japanese conclusions than about Japanese process. Who was authorized to speak, who was tasked with gathering information, and which channels were activated would, in the American view, matter more than the literal phrasing once decrypted. The structure of the communication was expected to expose fault lines between civilian and military authority without explicitly naming them. Importantly, U.S. intelligence did not expect the message to demonstrate immediate comprehension of the weapon's strategic implications. The prevailing assessment was that Japanese leadership, like all institutions confronted with unprecedented data, would initially attempt to interpret the event through existing analytical frameworks. Analysts expected references to bomb tonnage, delivery method, or industrial capacity, all familiar metrics that could be debated without forcing a revision of core assumptions about warfare. Any indication that the message went beyond these categories would be notable precisely because it would violate expectation rather than confirm it. There was also an assumption of temporal compression. The speed with which the message had been transmitted suggested urgency, but American analysts did not equate urgency with clarity. They expected a document composed under informational scarcity, reflecting a need to respond quickly rather than a settled understanding of events. This expectation shaped how early decrypted fragments were read. Ambiguity was not treated as accidental. It was treated as diagnostic of a leadership operating under pressure, attempting to preserve optionality while gathering facts. In sum, before the message was read in full, U.S. intelligence circles anticipated continuity rather than rupture. They expected evidence of shock, but filtered through bureaucratic restraint. They expected uncertainty, but expressed indirectly. Above all, they expected the message to confirm a familiar pattern, that the Japanese decision-making system, when confronted with a disruptive external input, would first turn inward, seeking to reconcile the anomaly with existing structures before allowing it to alter strategic orientation. The analytical significance of the intercept, therefore, lay not in hopes of dramatic disclosure but in the possibility that even within such constrained expectations, small deviations might signal a deeper destabilization already underway. The intercepted communication entered an analytical pipeline that had been refined through years of sustained exposure to Japanese diplomatic and governmental traffic, a process designed less for speed than for controlled certainty. Initial handling focused on isolating the transmission's technical characteristics, confirming its integrity, and determining whether it represented a complete message or a fragment of a longer exchange. Signal officers verified call signs, routing paths, and transmission timing against known patterns, ensuring that the material had not been corrupted in relay or deliberately manipulated through deceptive formatting. Only once authenticity was provisionally established did the document move to the linguists and cryptanalysts responsible for rendering it intelligible. Translation proceeded in stages, beginning with a literal reconstruction of the decrypted text and advancing gradually toward interpretive clarity. Linguists resisted the temptation to impose fluency too early, aware that Japanese high-level communications often derived their meaning from syntactic restraint rather than explicit statement. Early drafts preserved ambiguity, flagging phrases whose grammatical structure allowed multiple readings. Particular attention was paid to modal verbs, honorific constructions, and omissions, all of which could signal hierarchy, uncertainty, or internal disagreement. Analysts understood that what was left unsaid often carried as much weight as what appeared on the page. Parallel to linguistic work, verification teams cross-referenced the message against existing intelligence holdings. Names, offices, and procedural references were checked against personnel files and prior intercepts to confirm authorship and intent. The institutional position of the sender mattered as much as the words themselves. A directive originating from a civilian ministry carried different implications than one transmitted through military command channels, even if the language appeared similar. Analysts mapped the communication onto known bureaucratic structures, assessing which factions within the Japanese state were likely involved and which were conspicuously absent. Contextualization extended beyond internal Japanese politics to the broader informational environment in which the message was produced. Intelligence officers examined what the sender could plausibly have known at the moment of transmission. Reports from Hiroshima were still incomplete, and domestic Japanese censorship further constrained information flow. The message was therefore read as a product of partial awareness, shaped by rumor, preliminary damage assessments, and the absence of authoritative technical explanation. Analysts treated this constraint not as a flaw but as a key interpretive variable, allowing them to distinguish between deliberate obfuscation and genuine uncertainty. As translation stabilized, attention shifted to tone and function. The communication was analyzed not simply as a carrier of information but as an act within an institutional system. Was it instructive, inquisitive, or cautionary? Did it seek to narrow discussion or expand it? Analysts parsed sentence order and emphasis, noting where procedural directives preceded descriptive content, a sequencing choice that suggested an attempt to impose control before understanding had been achieved. Such structural features were cataloged systematically, compared against historical precedents from earlier crises to identify continuity or deviation. Verification also involved negative confirmation. Intelligence officers examined concurrent Japanese traffic to determine whether the message aligned with or contradicted other communications moving through the system. Silence in adjacent channels was itself evaluated, particularly where rapid follow-on messaging might normally be expected. The absence of reinforcing directives or clarifying addenda suggested hesitation rather than decisiveness, reinforcing interpretations drawn from the primary text. Analysts were careful, however, to avoid inferring intent from a single data point, maintaining provisional assessments subject to revision as additional material emerged. Throughout this process, conclusions were deliberately incremental. draft assessments circulated with confidence levels attached, and dissenting interpretations were recorded rather than suppressed. Senior intelligence officers emphasized that the purpose of analysis was not to predict Japanese action but to understand Japanese cognition at a specific moment under informational stress. The translated and contextualized message was ultimately presented not as a definitive statement of policy but as a snapshot of an institutional mind attempting to orient itself after a disruptive event. Its value lay in revealing process rather than outcome, offering insight into how a complex, hierarchical system metabolized shock before it could articulate response. As the translated text settled into analytical focus, it became apparent that the communication carried implications that exceeded the narrow expectations initially attached to it. The severity did not present itself through overt alarm or explicit concession, but through a subtle realignment of priorities embedded in the message's structure and intent. Analysts recognized that the language, while restrained, reflected a departure from routine crisis management. The communication did not merely seek clarification or impose message discipline. It implicitly acknowledged that the existing interpretive frameworks were insufficient to account for the event that had occurred. This recognition, though indirect, marked a qualitative shift in the Japanese leadership's internal posture. One of the most consequential indicators lay in the scope of authority implied by the message. It addressed actors beyond the immediate military chain, drawing in diplomatic and scientific channels in a manner that suggested the problem could not be resolved within conventional operational boundaries. For American intelligence, this expansion of audience signaled that the Japanese leadership perceived the issue as systemic rather than localized. The weapons effects were no longer being treated as an extension of strategic bombing but as an anomaly demanding cross-institutional assessment. That realization carried weight precisely because it contradicted the assumption that Japanese decision-making would initially narrow its focus to preserve doctrinal continuity. Equally striking was the message's treatment of uncertainty. Rather than masking ambiguity through declarative language, it institutionalized doubt by formalizing the search for external verification. Analysts noted that this approach effectively suspended judgment at the highest levels, delaying any definitive interpretation until corroboration could be obtained. Such procedural hesitation was rare in communications originating near the apex of the Japanese state, where authority traditionally flowed downward through confident assertion. The willingness to admit informational insufficiency, even obliquely, suggested that the leadership understood the potential consequences of misclassification and was unwilling to commit prematurely to an explanatory model that might later prove inadequate. The gravity of the message also emerged through its temporal orientation. Instead of framing the event as an immediate tactical concern, the communication implied a longer horizon of consequence, one in which the implications of the weapon would unfold over time rather than be resolved through immediate counteraction. This shift away from short-term operational response toward sustained evaluation indicated that the leadership recognized the possibility of strategic disruption rather than episodic damage. American analysts interpreted this as an acknowledgement that the attack might alter the conditions under which all subsequent decisions would be made, a recognition far more consequential than any explicit statement of loss. What intensified this assessment was the absence of compensatory rhetoric. There were no references to resilience, endurance, or inevitable victory, themes that had historically appeared even in dire communications. The omission was not accidental. Analysts understood it as a deliberate avoidance of language that could prematurely lock the leadership into a narrative of continuity. By withholding such framing, the message preserved analytical flexibility at the cost of ideological reassurance. This choice suggested that the leadership sensed the inadequacy of familiar narratives and was temporarily prioritizing comprehension over cohesion. The cumulative effect of these elements forced American intelligence officers to revise their internal evaluation of the message's significance. What had been anticipated as a procedural response now appeared as an early indicator of strategic destabilization. The severity lay not in panic but in the implicit recognition that the event challenged foundational assumptions about warfare, deterrence, and control. Analysts did not interpret this as immediate capitulation or even as conscious acceptance of defeat. Instead, they saw evidence of an institutional system encountering limits to its capacity for denial. This realization altered how subsequent Japanese communications were read. The message became a reference point against which later traffic was measured, its subdued but expansive approach serving as a baseline for assessing whether the leadership was moving toward integration of the new reality or retreating back into established patterns. In this sense, the intercepted communication marked a threshold moment. It revealed that the consequences of the Hiroshima attack, at least within the Japanese decision-making apparatus, were already exceeding the parameters anticipated by American intelligence. The severity was cognitive rather than material, residing in the recognition that the existing order of understanding had been disrupted and that restoring coherence would require more than routine administrative adjustment. As the analytical weight of the intercepted communications settled across intelligence desks in Washington and the Pacific, a quiet but consequential reassessment took place within American intelligence institutions. This was not a reversal of conclusions so much as a recalibration of confidence levels, assumptions, and analytical posture. The message had not delivered a definitive statement of Japanese intent, yet it had destabilized several working models that had guided American interpretation up to that point. Analysts recognized that their earlier expectations, grounded in patterns of bureaucratic minimization and ideological inertia, no longer fully accounted for what the communication revealed about Japanese internal processing of the event. The reassessment began with a reevaluation of tempo. American intelligence had assumed that Japanese leadership would require time to absorb the implications of the Hiroshima attack, constrained by damaged communications, censorship, and institutional rigidity. The intercepted message suggested otherwise. While comprehension was incomplete, reaction had been rapid, and more importantly, it had occurred at a level of authority capable of coordinating across institutional boundaries. This forced analysts to reconsider the speed at which cognitive disruption could propagate through the Japanese state, even in the absence of full technical understanding. The possibility that strategic shock could outpace doctrinal resistance altered how subsequent indicators would be weighted. There was also a reassessment of informational vulnerability. The message demonstrated that Japanese leadership was acutely aware of gaps in its own situational awareness and was willing, at least temporarily, to acknowledge those gaps procedurally. For American intelligence, this complicated the prevailing assumption that denial would dominate early reactions. Analysts now had to account for a more nuanced response pattern, one in which uncertainty did not immediately translate into ideological closure. This raised the possibility that Japanese decision-making might oscillate between recognition and repression rather than follow a linear path toward either acceptance or dismissal. Institutional psychology became a focal point of renewed analysis. The communication suggested a leadership under strain not because it had lost control, but because it recognized the limits of its existing control mechanisms. American intelligence officers debated whether this recognition would produce adaptive behavior or trigger defensive retrenchment. Both outcomes were plausible, and the message itself did not resolve the question. What it did establish was that the leadership was operating in a liminal state, aware that something fundamental had shifted but uncertain how to integrate that awareness without destabilizing the system it governed. This ambiguity prompted a revision in analytical framing. Rather than treating Japanese communications as indicators of fixed intent, analysts increasingly viewed them as artifacts of an evolving cognitive process. The intercepted message was reclassified not as a signal of imminent action, but as evidence of internal deliberation under unprecedented conditions. Intelligence estimates were adjusted accordingly, emphasizing ranges of possibility over discrete predictions. Confidence levels were lowered not as a sign of analytical weakness, but as an acknowledgement that the underlying variables had become more volatile. The reassessment also extended to assumptions about leverage. The message implied that the Hiroshima attack had penetrated the Japanese decision-making apparatus in a way that conventional bombing had not. This raised questions about how power asymmetry was being perceived on the other side. American intelligence did not assume that recognition of vulnerability would translate into compliance, but it did suggest that the psychological balance had shifted. Analysts began to consider that the Japanese leadership might now be weighing costs and risks using altered reference points, even if outward rhetoric remained unchanged. Crucially, this internal reassessment was conducted with methodological restraint. Intelligence officers resisted the urge to overinterpret a single data point, emphasizing that institutional collapse rarely announces itself cleanly. The message was integrated into a broader mosaic of intercepts, reports, and behavioral indicators, each contributing incrementally to an updated picture of Japanese cognition. What changed was not the conclusion but the posture. A heightened sensitivity to subtle deviations, a willingness to entertain competing interpretations, and an awareness that prior models might no longer be sufficient. By the end of this reassessment, American intelligence had not arrived at certainty, nor had it abandoned skepticism. Instead, it had adjusted its analytical stance to reflect a new reality in which the Japanese leadership appeared both constrained by tradition and unsettled by novelty. The intercepted message had forced a recognition that rational systems under extreme stress do not fail all at once, but pass through phases of partial awareness and controlled hesitation. Understanding that process, rather than predicting its outcome, became the immediate analytical priority. When viewed in aggregate rather than in isolation, the intercepted communication assumed a significance that extended beyond its immediate informational content. It offered American intelligence a rare, time-sensitive window into Japan's post-Hiroshima position at a moment when public statements, battlefield reports, and conventional indicators lagged behind internal cognition. The value of the message lay not in what it declared, but in what it revealed about how the Japanese state was orienting itself after an event that defied established categories of assessment. It functioned as an institutional artifact, exposing the posture of a system caught between recognition and preservation. The communication suggested that Japan's leadership was no longer operating from a position of analytical continuity. While outward structures remained intact, the internal logic guiding decision-making had been disrupted. The need to seek verification, the expansion of consultative channels, and the restraint embedded in the language all indicated that Hiroshima had forced the leadership into a provisional stance. This was neither acceptance nor rejection of the new reality, but the suspension of judgment that reflected the absence of a workable interpretive framework. For American intelligence, this was a critical distinction. It meant that Japan's position could not be understood through static categories such as resolve or collapse, but only through a dynamic process of adjustment under stress. The message also clarified the asymmetry of information shaping post-Hiroshima decision-making. Japan was reacting to an event whose technical parameters it did not yet comprehend, while the United States possessed both the means and the explanatory model for what had occurred. This imbalance was evident in the Japanese leadership's reliance on external observation to supplement internal reporting. The intercepted communication thus highlighted a structural disadvantage that extended beyond material capacity into the realm of knowledge production. American intelligence recognized that this asymmetry constrained Japan's options not by force alone, but by limiting its ability to accurately assess risk, scale, and future threat. Equally important was what the message revealed about institutional cohesion. The absence of ideological reinforcement language suggested a temporary prioritization of analysis over morale management. This indicated that, at least in the immediate aftermath, the leadership was willing to tolerate ambiguity rather than impose premature narrative closure. For intelligence analysts, this tolerance was significant because it implied that the system had not yet defaulted to denial as a protective mechanism. The Japanese position, as inferred from the communication, was therefore unstable but not yet rigidified, a condition that allowed for multiple trajectories depending on how subsequent information was processed. The intercepted message also complicated assumptions about agency within the Japanese state. It demonstrated that the response to Hiroshima was not being monopolized by a single faction or doctrinal lens. Instead, the communication reflected an attempt to coordinate across bureaucratic boundaries, suggesting that the leadership recognized the insufficiency of any one institutional perspective. This diffusion of analytical responsibility pointed to an internal debate that had not yet been resolved, reinforcing the view that Japan's post-Hiroshima position was characterized by deliberation rather than determination. For American intelligence, the broader significance lay in how this understanding reshaped interpretive strategy. the message became a benchmark against which Japan's subsequent behavior could be measured, not in terms of consistency, but in terms of drift. Analysts were less concerned with whether Japan would immediately alter its course than with whether its internal communications would continue to exhibit signs of constrained uncertainty or retreat into formulaic assertion. The intercepted communication thus served as an early diagnostic tool, allowing intelligence officers to track changes in institutional psychology over time rather than relying solely on overt actions. In this sense, the message illuminated the nature of Japan's post-Hiroshima position as fundamentally transitional. It was a moment defined by incomplete comprehension, procedural caution, and an awareness, still unarticulated, of strategic vulnerability. American intelligence did not interpret this as weakness in the conventional sense, but as evidence that the Japanese decision-making system had entered a phase where its traditional mechanisms for absorbing shock were under strain. Understanding that condition provided a more accurate basis for assessing Japan's posture than any single declaration or military movement could offer. The intercepted communication, modest in length and restrained in tone, thus acquired enduring significance as a lens through which the evolving balance of power and perception could be more precisely understood.